So this is the second lecture in the series revolving around chapter 4, so cell injury, death. And so we're going to look at just some basics in terms of understanding how cells adapt to different types of stress. So what is cellular adaptation to begin? So the cells can change to stresses in both the internal as well as external environment. And there's a variety of ways they change. We're going to look at these kind of key canonical models here. Some change their size, some proliferate, some reduce their numbers, some change what type of cell they even give rise to. Some have a single mode of action, others have multiple modes of actions. Essentially, it leads to these 6 categories that we're going to look at: atrophy, hypertrophy, hyperplasia, metaplasia, and dysplasia. So we have up here the row for the normal cells. So this would be some happy little cuboidal cells. Maybe you'd find these in like the kidney, for example. If they were to undergo atrophy, this would be the size decrease. Hypertrophy means they become physically larger. Hyperplasia, they become just more of them. The population increases for those. Metaplasia means they move from becoming one cell type to a different cell type, related cell type nonetheless. And then dysplasia is a overall disorderly and disorganized growth or replacement pattern. So let's take a peek at those individually. The first one I want to talk about is atrophy. So A without, and then trophy is referring to eating or food, trophic, right? So this is without food. These are cells that are starved either nutritionally or from oxygen, causing them to decrease in cell size, right? So often the same number, but they physically just can't grow as large. So for atrophy, this means that we decrease the work demands. I'm sorry, I should say work output, really, in response to all of these environmental stresses or conditions. It's actually an interesting adaptation because they grow physically smaller in size, they're able to still remain functional just at a lower level. And so when there's less of the environment to give, they're able to survive with less. So examples would be things like, say, your muscles. If you're not exercising, you're not using them, you're going to lose them, right? So they're going to physically, size-wise, reduce in response to lower workloads. And as workloads increase, then they would increase. Let's see here. So let's talk about the 5 categories. So first, there's going to be the category of atrophy when the cells are in a tissue or part of the body that is in disuse. And you might want to think of people that have one leg in a cast, for example. So after however many weeks, the cast is removed and that leg is actually physically smaller. It's a bit shriveled. That would be an example of disuse. Denervation. So if the brain can't sense it and the cells and tissues themselves are no longer receiving inputs from the brain, this is considered denervation, right? And so denervation can result from something like a paralyzed limb, right? So they become physically smaller because there's a lack of communication with the nervous system. Sometimes it's a loss of endocrine stimulation. So an example would be lack of estrogen at menopause, and so that's going to cause a physical shrinking or atrophy of the female reproductive organs. Number 4 is always so important: inadequate nutrition. If they just don't have the tools to be able to make a full-size functional cell, they just don't have them and they won't. And finally is a pretty big sweeping category, actually. So this is ischemia. This is a lack of oxygen, lack of actually blood flow, blood that is oxygen rich to the area. So it deprives those cells of their access to oxygen. All right, so far we just looked at normal cells and atrophy cells. Now we're going to look at the opposite, so the hypertrophy cells that get bigger. So hyper, exceeding trophy, food. So this is a cell that has gotten so large. It's gotten, it definitely has an increased workload. So you can think of things like cardiac or skeletal muscle tissue. So they don't really have mitosis to be able to create more cells right away, but they just can make those cells that they do have physically larger. Oftentimes this is going to require the synthesis of extra cell parts or cellular components. And it can have it can change the look of or the overall physiology of the tissue either in that area or as to the organism as a whole. So exercise might be an example of where we can use hypertrophy to gain a little bit more muscle mass, right? And that's a good example of hypertrophy. And it's not actually even technically too much of a hypertrophy. It doesn't necessarily exceed. However, we're interested in the pathologic versions. And those pathologic versions could be things that are either like adaptive, so maybe the thickening of certain cell types just to stay functional. So an example might be that of the urinary bladder. Whenever there's a kind of an obstruction preventing urinary outflow. Also heart, so myocardial hypertrophy. When there's say like hypertension in an individual or heart disease. And we also have compensatory, so compensating, right? Compensatory. So this is the enlargement of certain organs or tissues after some of it has been removed or otherwise rendered inactive, usually by things like the nervous system. And yeah, so here's an example of cardiac hypertrophy. So this is an enlarging of the heart. So over here we see examples of normal hearts. So right here, right, and up here. And so this is a cross section where we're looking at the inner chambers of the heart, specifically the intraventricular septum right here. As you can see, it's much wider in a hypertrophied heart. Oh, I should use not red. Let's try green. That's probably sensible. There we go. Right, it's much larger here than it is here. It spreads out a little bit more, and the overall walls of the heart have become so enlarged because it's having to pump at such high pressure and sustain such high blood pressure that they become physically larger. And what that means is that there's less space to actually pull in blood and pump out blood, resulting in even more hypertension of the heart. So hyperplasia is so an increase, right, in the number of cells in an organ or tissue. However, it's the placement becomes a little bit disorganized, and as you can see here in these two examples on the dermis, generally these cells are undergoing mitosis, and it's still a relatively controlled response to something, say, sun exposure or whatnot, other different types of stress. However, I mean, I'm showing you kind of extreme examples here, especially this. This is simply a type of keratinosis. This little horn here on this person's cheek. It's just the persistent but improper growing of these cells. So they're not necessarily metastasized or traveling around the body, but they are still growing quite a bit. So some of these reactions can be due to disruptions in the genetic code, so exposure to UV light can actually physically damage the DNA and cause definite definitely some different physiological changes in response to that type of stress. However, others are in reaction to things like viruses, such as papillomavirus types, usually causing things like warts to appear. However, hyperplasia, even though it's sometimes in the examples we're seeing here, is out of the normal bounds of cellular response, it is an important response of connective tissue during healing processes. So let's see, we've looked at normal cells, atrophied cells, hypertrophy cells, hyperplasia cells, and now we're going to go look at metaplasia cells. So metaplasia is still a reversible change. So one adult cell type, say like epithelial cells or mesenchymal cells, will now be replaced by another type of cell, adult cell type. So these are going to generally involve reprogramming of undifferentiated stem cells that are present in that tissue, and they're able to undergo at that point the metaplastic changes. And these are in response usually to things like chronic irritation and inflammation. So the idea is you would substitute the new type of cell in the place of the old type of cell to better weather or handle and survive the stress. Until the stress is no longer there, hopefully. So the conversion of these cell types never changes the type of tissue it is, it just changes the type of cells produced by that tissue, for example. So I guess you could look at how stratified squamous epithelial cells can be substituted for normal ciliated columnar cells of the trachea, right? So here's some squamous and here's the columnar. And say, I believe we're going to say the trachea of someone who, for example, is like a smoker, right? Or a persistent smoker. So it would physically change the type of cells that they have lining the cavities of their lungs and their trachea. So we've looked at normal cells. Hold on, there we go. Normal cells, atrophied cells, hypertrophy cells, hyperplasia cells, metaplasia, and finally we're going to round it out with dysplasia. So dysplasia is the non-normal or disorganized cell growth within a specific tissue. Right, so things just don't go where they're supposed to go. Sometimes there can be changes in the cell sizes and shapes, and of course, like we said, organization as it forms tissue. Some of these include or are actually associated with things like chronic irritation, inflammation, immune response. Oftentimes, we look at metaplastic cells from the squamous epithelium of the respiratory tract as well as the cervix of the uterus. So if they're abnormal, it is considered adaptive and it's reversible after irritation's removed. However, if there's quite a bit of dysplasia, it can indicate the beginning of or indicate as a precursor to cancer. So there are usually pretty conventional exams that people can undergo, such as Pap tests, watching for the development of the dysplasia to see if it will progress. It's not always leading to cancer. Here I'm actually showing you an example of hip dysplasia, where there's no longer this nice little socket for the head of the femur to become adhered to in the hip joint, so it becomes hip dysplasia, right? So it's disorganized, inappropriate. Okay, so we looked at normal cells, atrophied cells, hypertrophy cells, hyperplasia, metaplasia, and dysplasia. So those are the main categories of cell types that you would want to keep an eye on in terms of response to stress. And if you have any questions, don't feel the need to hesitate. Please let me know right away.